Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed for part 2 of this month's Q&A series. There were quite a few additional questions that I wanted to get to after going for about half an hour in part 1 from you guys. Yeah, a lot of you guys asked questions in the YouTube community tab and also in our Discord community. So I thought, yeah, there's still some things to talk about, so we'll make a part 2. Part 1 is up on the channel right now if you're interested. I talk in that video about some of the OLED burn-in stuff, should use an OLED for work. We've also got some questions about tandem WOLEDs and upcoming technologies. So if you're interested in that, yeah, watch this video and then go check out part 1 that's up on the channel. But for now, let's get into part 2's questions. Today's video is brought to you by the Gigabyte MO32U24, a high-end, high-quality gaming monitor using the latest 32-inch 4K QD-OLED panel. This brand new Pentatandem panel for 2026 features upgraded performance compared to first-gen QD-OLEDs, including higher brightness, display HDR True Black 500 certification, and an advanced Obsidian Shield film that improves black levels and offers greater scratch resistance. This fast 240Hz monitor offers an elite gaming experience with beautiful HDR visuals and amazing motion clarity. Plus, it has one of the best feature sets I've seen on a Gigabyte monitor, including things like an OLED anti-flicker mode and a KVM switch. If you're after a Pentatandem QD OLED, the MO32U24 delivers outstanding value with a great price in many regions. I recommend it, so to learn more, check the links in the description below. As a fan of Pulsar technology, is there any plans from any company you know of that will be implementing it or something similar on OLED screens? So yeah, G-Sync Pulsar is obviously a very interesting technology, and yes, I'm still working on those reviews. I hopefully will get them out at some point, been sidetracked with a whole bunch of other stuff, though Pulsar testing is up on the channel if you want to see how G-Sync Pulsar works. But obviously this backlight strobing technology with variable refresh rate support that actually works well, allowing you to sort of just one-click enable it and use it across a wide variety of games, I think is very impressive. But of course, the current panels that we're seeing, it's being used with a 1440p 360Hz IPS LCD. So if you're someone that wants, the benefits of OLED with its HDR performance, black levels, all that sort of thing, you currently have to kind of sacrifice that to go for the G-Sync Pulsar option. So are there any plans to bring this to OLED screens? Well, currently there's a couple of limitations here. The first one is that the OLED panel vendors don't even really support standard backlight strobing, or at least on an OLED it would be referred to as black frame insertion, because there's no backlight, you don't really strobe it, but a sort of similar thing where the screen pulses briefly and then for the majority of the time it turns to black. We have seen black frame insertion implemented by some of the monitor vendors, so Asus, ELMB, that sort of thing. We have seen, but what it basically does on those screens is, let's say you've got a 500Hz monitor, it will simply just run the monitor at 500Hz, but then one frame will be the picture frame, the second frame will be a black frame. And so what you get is that you can only really use the monitor at half the refresh rate. So on the 500Hz example, it would be 250Hz. You get the clarity of the 500Hz screen, which is nice in a sense, but it's not true, I guess, backlight strobing like you see on some of those high-end LCDs, where you get this really short pulse and then a long black period. And what that allows it to do is give you the best motion clarity, because the shorter the pulse, and well, provided you can get enough brightness out of it, the better clarity you get. And so one of the things that Pulsar does really well is giving you that short pulse, but adjusting it over time, adjusting the windows and that sort of thing so that it works with variable refresh. And so the OLED panel vendors are not really offering that sort of thing. LG Display were talking about, offering some sort of BFI with some of their upcoming panels, but it still is very much seems to be this sort of, long black period, or sort of long picture period, long black period, similar to what the vendors like Asus are already doing with ELMB. It doesn't seem like they're keen on sort of implementing maybe a duty cycle of just 10% for the picture frames. It seems that the current technology that is being used to drive the panels isn't really able to do that. And you can sort of see why, right? Because with a LCD, you're sort of separating the LCD crystal layers and that sort of thing, the driving circuits for that, with the driving circuits for the backlight. So you can create a separate driving circuit for the backlight that can run really fast, but only does a very limited sort of thing, while the LCD crystal layer has a separate driving circuit that just runs normally. And so you can sort of benefit there and allow this strobing thing to work properly. Whereas with an OLED, everything is sort of in one. So if you were able to give these really short picture pulses on screen with an OLED, you could also theoretically run the panel at a really high refresh rate. And so it would already be offered at a higher refresh rate. That's sort of my thinking there. Maybe they can offer something separately that would enable this feature without enabling a higher refresh rate. I'm not sure, but essentially it requires the panel to be driven at a really high refresh rate. So that's the sort of first limitation. And then the second limitation is obviously around things that LCDs can do that OLEDs can't do. And that is run at higher brightness level. So one of the things that you usually see with something like G-Sync Pulsar is that the backlight brightness runs at a really high level to compensate for the fact that the brightness, the panel is off for a lot of the time. And so you just crank up the brightness, it averages out in your eyes, with the sort of persistence of vision and that sort of thing. It averages out to a suitable brightness level, but the actual impulse that you see from the backlight is at a really high brightness level. With an OLED, obviously, there are limitations to the brightness output, as you would have seen from a lot of the panels that are currently available. And so if you wanted to offer something like backlight strobing with a really short pulse, plus even things like HDR functionality, OLEDs would have to be able to run at much higher brightness levels than they're currently able to. Now, maybe they would be able to do that because they're showing black for so long. So things like power and heat would be sort of averaged out over time. So maybe they could be driven higher than they currently are. But obviously that would be a limitation as well. From my discussions with NVIDIA about G-Sync Pulsar and OLED monitors, they're very keen on getting this working with OLEDs at some point. So it's not like the technology is incompatible with OLEDs. It would just be up to the panel vendors able to offer this sort of functionality. G-Sync Pulsar works with a MediaTek scaler in the current versions of the LCDs that we're seeing. So theoretically, provided that particular scaler could be operated with OLEDs, you would be able to see it work. And it seems to be something that maybe NVIDIA are considering in the background, but it seems like there's still a gulf in the current capabilities that are available. So that's just the current situation, I guess, with a technology like Pulsar on OLED. And of course, it may be difficult to get things like VRR flicker minimized, considering that is also an issue with OLED panels. So yeah, hopefully we see it at some point, but currently I would say it is not going to be anytime soon. On WOLED monitors, is it possible to reduce the dark grey banding by operating at below the max refresh rate? For example, operating the 280Hz WOLED panels at 240 or 180Hz. Yeah, pretty simple question, this one. So the answer is yes. Grey banding is related to the refresh rate. So the higher the refresh rate that you use, the more visible grey banding is, which also means that on the 540Hz models, those have more visible grey banding and worse grey uniformity than you see on the 280Hz models. And also what you see on the 165Hz models. So for example, the 39-inch LG WOLED Ultra Wide, the 5K, 2K model, that has less grey banding than you see on the 280Hz models. And you can get this benefit just by taking one of those 280Hz models and turning it down to a lower refresh rate. Unfortunately, though, you probably won't see a huge difference between something like 280 and 240Hz. Those are too close in refresh rates to really get a significant difference. If you did turn it down to 180 or 165Hz, then yes, you would see less grey banding. However, it is running at a lower refresh rate then. Did you want to use the highest refresh rate of your monitor? It's not a great solution, right? You've bought a 280Hz monitor, you're turning it down to avoid grey banding. Not ideal, but one of the things that we have seen, and I mentioned this in part 1 of the Q&A, is that the newer tandem WOLEDs using RGB stripe do not have grey banding issues. So I would assume that eventually we will see the 1440p panels transition over to using RGB stripe. Grey banding shouldn't be an issue on those monitors. Of course, there are trade-offs between the RGB stripe and RGWB versions, as we've discussed in some of our reviews. But with the current tandem WOLED, this is not great advice for someone that's got a 280Hz tandem WOLED, right? Because I'm sort of saying a future technology will fix this. But essentially, yes, if you have got one of the tandem WOLED monitors, if you run it at a lower refresh rate, grey banding will be lower. You won't notice it as much, but then you're sacrificing the refresh rate. So pretty significant trade-off in my opinion. With HDMI 2.2 doubling bandwidth to 96 gigabits per second, do you expect monitor manufacturers to adopt full bandwidth HDMI 2.2 ports soon, or will we see bandwidth capped versions similar to what happened with HDMI 2.1, for example 24 or 40 gigabits per second ports? Yes, so basically I would expect them to use bandwidth capped ports because we're also seeing this with some of the DisplayPort 2.1 monitors. The reason for this is that when you're enabling or integrating the circuitry to run at the really highest bandwidth levels, even with something like DisplayPort 2.1 that goes up to 80 gigabits per second, it does introduce complexities to the PCB design and also to the connector circuitry. You have to do more shielding and that sort of thing to allow it to actually run at 80 gigabits per second without interference. And so if you're able to get the ports running at sort of these lower specs, like for example, if you had DisplayPort 2.1 and you could run it at UHBR 13.5, which is 54 gigabits per second, instead of UHBR 20 at 80 gigabits per second, you don't have to be as tight with some of your design tolerances on the PCBs and connectors, and you can get it validated for that lower spec, potentially at a lower cost, or you can use a lower quality connector and that sort of thing. So it can save money, it can save engineering effort, and that's why on some monitors you see the use of DisplayPort 2.1, but because the bandwidth of the full UHBR 20 isn't necessary, they opt for those lower specs. You might just be going, well, why would they do that? Why wouldn't they just give you the full thing? It's because of the added cost, and that is reflected in the price of monitors. Often you would see two different variants. One's DisplayPort 1.4, one's DisplayPort 2.1 UHBR 20, and the UHBR 20 version is much more expensive. It may even require a different scaler, for example, because the scalers that support the lower spec are cheaper. And I would be expecting that with certainly HDMI 2.1 versus 2.2. The newer scalers that would support the 2.2 feature are probably going to be much more expensive than the older scalers that support HDMI 2.1. And so with the cost difference, I think you'll see monitor vendors being quite conservative with it. The other thing that we see as well is that, the bandwidth of HDMI 2.2 is really not required in a lot of cases, especially for PC applications where a lot of people will just hook up the display over DisplayPort anyway. So one of the things that we've sort of seen recently is with those 6K 165Hz monitors, those actually do require DisplayPort 2.1. The bandwidth to run 6K 165Hz exceeds what DisplayPort 1.4 can do, even with DSC enabled over DisplayPort 1.4. So if you buy one of the Samsung G80HS models and you try and hook it up over DisplayPort 1.4, you're limited to 60 Hz because it simply cannot run at 165 Hz. However, even on that monitor, HDMI 2.1 at 48 gigabits per second with DSC is sufficient for 6K 165 Hz. So if you're talking about doubling the bandwidth, there's currently no monitor available right now with any sort of technology that you can use right now that would require 96 gigabits per second, and certainly probably not above what you see from DisplayPort 2.1. Now, would it enable things like, the use of, the full bandwidth without DSC? Yes, you'd get more of those capabilities. We've sort of talked on the channel before about how DSC isn't really that bad of a thing, so long as it, works with your display, works with your GPU as well. You shouldn't really see any negatives to using DSC, so I'm not overly concerned about that angle. But it's more, the monitors that require the highest bandwidth would benefit from something like HDMI 2.2. But once it gets to that point where monitors exceed what HDMI 2.1 can achieve, so for example, if there was like an 8K 240Hz monitor or something that probably wouldn't work over HDMI 2.1 at 48 gigabits per second, what they should be doing is implementing HDMI 2.2, so you can still utilize the highest bandwidth over HDMI, provided that you've got a supported GPU. Again, no current GPU support. This is all future-looking stuff, but what I would like to ideally see is HDMI 2.2 used, but they wouldn't necessarily need to use the full 96 gigabits per second. I think that's perfectly fine. One of the issues that we saw with HDMI 2.2, or HDMI 2.1, I should say, with the 24 gigabits per second models and sometimes the 40 gigabits per second models, is that there were some source devices that would give some weird configurations on, say, the 24 gigabits per second displays. So the PlayStation 5, for example, if you've got a 48 gigabits per second display, it'll give you the full picture quality, no chroma subsampling or anything like that. But if you try and use it on a 24 gigabits per second monitor, because for some reason the PlayStation 5 doesn't support DSC, it will use chroma subsampling on those higher refresh rate configurations at 4K. So yeah, that was sort of, I guess you could sort of blame Sony for not implementing DSC properly on that monitor, or on the PlayStation 5, I should say. But hopefully we don't see that with, future consoles and that sort of thing. And hopefully, if we do have monitors that use lower bandwidth configurations, they will work just fine with all of the source devices that you want to use. So yeah, that's what I would sort of expect with upcoming HDMI 2.2 products, but they still seem like it's quite far away and probably not necessary anytime soon. What sticking points are left on OLED that you want to see fixed before it just becomes the de facto default recommendation for everyone? I think in some respects we're already kind of at the default recommendation stage with some of the products, though it is largely dependent on price. So for example, we started to see this year the $350 1440p QD OLEDs, which were, they're nice, 27-inch panels, latest QD OLED, well, the 2024 version QD OLED technology, 240Hz refresh rate, they work really well, but to achieve that lower price point, they are limited in brightness. However, because there's so many benefits to gaming that OLED panels bring in terms of motion quality, black levels, and while the HDR performance on those panels is not great, you still get a lot of those contrast benefits and motion benefits in SDR games. And so for me, once I saw that Alienware model at $350, it sort of becomes the default recommendation at that price point compared to IPS LCDs that were being offered previously at similar sorts of refresh rates. So again, like previously, you could have bought for $350 like a 1440p, 240Hz, or even sometimes 300Hz plus IPS LCD. But yeah, right now I would just say get an OLED instead, even if you're not able to achieve the HDR performance. So in some respects, we're there. In other respects, not so much, because there are some product categories, of course, where they're available. IPS LCDs in particular are available for a lot lower prices. So even something like 27-inch 4K or the lower refresh rate 1440p models, there's still a lot of benefits to getting LCD from the price standpoint. But I think in terms of an overall recommendation, there are still some things that LCDs do better. Obviously, overall brightness is one of them. So for SDR applications, for example, if you really do need high brightness levels to cut down on glare, for example, then the latest LCDs are able to push up to like 800 nits and crazy things like that in SDR use. OLEDs don't really get close to that. So that is one of the sticking points. Obviously as well, full screen HDR brightness is an issue on the current OLED technology compared to what you would see from mini LED monitors. And then you've got things like panel dimming that we're seeing on QD OLEDs and some of the latest LG Display WOLEDs as well. And so, LCDs don't really have that sort of problem. And so they are able to offer more consistent HDR brightness across all different types of content. So once we sort of see OLEDs able to handle that better, they would become the default go-to recommendation for everyone, because there are people that are not as concerned with things like contrast, for example, in HDR scenes. I'm someone that does prefer contrast, but some people don't. Some people love the punch of the brightness. They want the highest brightness possible. And so LCDs provide that. They're also generally more efficient in some applications. So if you were using it all day, every day, and you didn't want your power bills to be as high, you can save quite well. We're still talking about under 100 watt devices, but it can add up in that sense. And then longevity as well. So LCDs will typically last a lot longer than you'd see from an OLED, no real burning concerns and that sort of thing. And they're able to do things like we sort of talked earlier in this Q&A about G-Sync Pulsar. So things like that are available with LCDs, but are not currently available with OLEDs. So there are still a lot of areas that these technologies can improve. Oh, and even one thing that I've just thought about, resolution. We've started to see 5K and 6K panels available with LCDs. I think there's some thoughts that 5K OLEDs will be coming soon. Not sure about 6K, that could be further away. But things like that, it seems that LCD is able to get to those sort of specs and things before OLED. So yeah, there are certainly some sticking points that mean that I'm not just universally recommending OLEDs to everyone. However, we're getting closer to the point where across a broad range of price points, my go-to choice for most people is I think you should probably get an OLED at that price point or this price point. And for LCDs, it's more for higher end buyers. Are you largely using it for productivity, or are there some niche use cases that you might want an LCD for? And then, of course, for the budget stuff where LCDs are still dominant. So, yeah, we'll see how that goes. Hopefully, OLED can continue to improve. But LCDs, yeah, they still have a place today. What about 3D monitors? I'd like to see them try again. Well, good news for you, because they are trying again. We have seen at some trade shows, and they are actually available if you want to purchase them, that there are quite a few glasses-free 3D options available from vendors like Acer and Samsung. So I think Samsung, for example, we saw their glasses-free 6K monitor at CES earlier this year. And honestly, it is very impressive in how it works. It does give you a genuine 3D effect. It uses eye tracking and manipulation of the screen to sort of give you a 3D effect in games. There are quite a number of limitations to it though, which is why I would sort of say it's not really ready for prime time just yet, and whether it will ever be ready for prime time is questionable. One of the main limitations, of course, is that it requires game support, game integration to get 3D working properly. So you can't just go into any game that you want to play and access 3D display technology. Samsung has somewhat of a decent list of games. I think they claim to be supporting something like 80 games, maybe 100 games when I talked to them at CES, but a lot of major titles aren't supported with 3D technology, the latest AAA stuff that you might want to use with it. So that's a limitation. And then the other limitation is that the panel is actually changed on a hardware standpoint. There is a lens array that is added to the front of the screen that allows light to be split between your eyes a bit more easily. And that does reduce the resolution, the clarity of the panel when you're not using it in a 3D configuration. So it does become a monitor that is kind of only set up to be used for 3D, which then runs into problems because of the game compatibility angle, where if you are just playing a game without 3D enabled, you're actually getting worse image quality than you would see from the panel being used. Let's say it's just a panel without 3D capabilities. That panel will look better in 2D applications. So they're trying to bring this back, and I think it would be nice to have this feature work really well, right? Because it does add to the immersion if it works really well. I think the days of people accepting wearing glasses while using 3D, I think that is done. That's over. People don't want to use that with monitors. If you're adding some sort of thing to your face to be used with a monitor, you may as well just buy a VR headset at that point. But I think with the glasses free stuff, there is potential there, but it's still a long way, at least based on what I've seen. I haven't tested these monitors in depth, so it's just based on what I've seen at trade shows. I think it's still a long way off being this sort of mainstream acceptable thing that everyone has in their homes. But is it going to be a thing in the future? I mean, maybe. I don't think it's as dead as it was. The glasses, as I said, the stuff that requires glasses, I think is dead. But these eye tracking stuff, I was actually really impressed with how the 3D worked. So maybe I'll get one in to test at some point. But it's not dead. And you can actually purchase those displays right now if you really want to. Is HDR overrated? Yeah, quite a spicy question from one of our Discord members there. Yeah, is HDR overrated? I've seen this sentiment from some people. If you go into certain communities, browse some things on Reddit, people saying, I bought an HDR monitor. I didn't find it that impressive compared to SDR, or, the games I'm playing don't support HDR. Isn't it a bit overrated? So, from that sense, is it overrated? Maybe. I would say in general, no, though, just from a number of reasons. The first thing is that once you have an HDR-enabled display, you're getting a quite significant improvement in visual quality, in my opinion, when HDR is implemented properly, without any real cost on the GPU hardware side. It isn't more intensive, or graphically intensive, I should say, to render games in HDR compared to SDR. So once you've got that HDR display in place, and of course this is a cost, so it's sort of like, I'm sort of saying, you can obviously upgrade your GPU to get better visuals as well, as opposed to upgrading your display. But once you get your display in, you will see in games with good HDR experience, good implementations of HDR, you should see quite a significant improvement to visuals, similar to going from, say, medium to ultra settings, because the depth to the image is significantly improved with HDR. Brightness becomes significantly improved. You get a lot more pop. You get a lot more contrast. And there's also, of course, color benefits as well. Wider color gamuts and those sorts of things are supported. So in some sense, it is like going from lower quality settings to higher quality settings. The image looks better in games with good HDR implementations. And so from that sense, I would say absolutely it is not overhyped or overrated or anything like that, because you don't have to upgrade your GPU, you get a much better image. So I think that's an overall win. I think where this sentiment comes from is obviously there are games that don't support HDR that are released these days, in 2026 with no HDR support. I think that is pretty much unacceptable, not great, not a good experience, and is disappointing for people if there's a game you really wanted to play, doesn't natively support HDR. And then there are a range of games as well which come out with quite poor HDR implementations, though these days there are some great mods like Reno DX that you can add to games that changes the HDR rendering pipeline and often gives significant visual quality benefits. So in those games where the HDR is really crappy and it's sort of like a popular AAA title, you'll often find a Reno DX mod that you can install in that game, completely changes the image quality, gives you much better contrast, because there are often issues like things like limited brightness output, peak brightness doesn't really get to the highs that it should, or maybe there's black crush, or maybe there's black limitations. It doesn't get as deep or contrasty as it should look, and those mods can often fix a lot of those problems. So again, like once HDR is implemented properly, I think it is absolutely not overrated. It looks great. It gives you significant visual quality benefits. But then, there are some games as well where HDR isn't of much benefit. In some multiplayer games that aren't really set up for HDR, HDR can actually make it more difficult to play games. I have heard mixed reports on that. In some titles, like I think it was Battlefield 6, when it came out, HDR actually gave you better dynamic range, and so you could actually more easily see into some of the bright, contrasty areas. But then there are other titles which have a more flat visual style, and with HDR, they sort of take what is already a blown out area and it just makes it brighter and more blown out, so it kind of is harder on your eyes to spot enemies. Again, the changes to sort of the gamma curve that you see with HDR as well can make shadow detail, well, it improves shadow detail, but it makes shadows darker, so it can make enemies harder to spot in some of those dark areas. So if you're sort of a primarily multiplayer gamer and you're playing things like Apex Legends or Valorant or some of these titles, CSGO for example, that don't really support HDR or don't benefit from HDR, then yes, HDR in those games is very much overrated. And then, there are some games as well. You may be a gamer that, instead of wanting the best visuals, you want the game to be the most enjoyable to play, or maybe the easiest to play. And you use features like shadow boosting on LCDs or that sort of thing, or even OLEDs, in which case then, yes, HDR with, again, its changes to gamma, making things look a bit more contrasty, giving you those better black levels. If you're someone that uses shadow boosting, you're kind of reversing that effect. You're making it harder again to see enemies, spot them in shadows. Maybe it makes the game harder for you to play, in which case from that sense it is overrated. But if I was to give sort of a blanket answer to this question, HDR is not overrated. It's well worth upgrading to a monitor that supports HDR, so that in the games that support HDR well, you get a significant visual benefit. And we're starting to see games get better at implementing HDR. There are mods now that can solve poor HDR implementations in games that haven't done it properly. And again, with that sort of Battlefield 6 example, it seems like there will be a future where multiplayer gaming can be played with HDR and to give you a benefit in those titles as well. So not overrated. Get an HDR monitor. And because OLEDs are sort of the best panel format at the moment, in my opinion, for gaming anyway, it's kind of just given to you by default. So that's kind of a benefit, I guess. Would you turn on HDR in games when using a monitor with wide color gamut but no/very few dimming zones just to get the increased color volume, or would you stick to, I guess, SDR sRGB? Yeah, interesting question, because obviously there are a lot of monitors that were released in the sort of early days of HDR products, I guess, where there was sort of, the display HDR 400 tier stuff, which is a garbage tier, sort of gives you a garbage HDR experience. But those panels, some of them do have better than SDR capabilities, usually in the form of things like color gamut, for example. And so if you go from, the sRGB color gamut to something that's, say, 80% Rec 2020, like some of the quantum dot and enhanced IPS LCDs did back in the day, but they may not have the dimming zones like this question alludes to, then, yes, that is one aspect that may be improved by enabling HDR. However, you may actually see the image quality get worse in other aspects. A lot of those early monitors do not have very good HDR calibration to begin with. So what you can see when enabling HDR is that your gamma goes really weird, so you don't really see this nice deeper image, in terms of the more contrasty look, the better black levels, that sort of thing may not be possible on a monitor without mini LED backlighting. But essentially, they can look weird, is what I'm trying to say. Some of those monitors, even just in the desktop with HDR enabled, look very bizarre, and that's because really no work was put in to calibrate them for HDR. So while you may be able to enable the HDR mode, you may be able to get more saturation in terms of colors, more vibrance, wider color gamut, you may find that the overall image looks worse even despite of that because of those limitations. The other problem is, and this is kind of related to how HDR processing works, is that HDR uses a much more aggressive tone curve. So the gamma, the HDR EOTF curves that we talk about a lot in the reviews, that is much more aggressive than you see with SDR. So what I mean by more aggressive is it allocates more of the data that is used for shadow detail. So with SDR, gamma 2.2 and that sort of thing, there is still this bias towards darker tones because human eyes are better at distinguishing between different shades of grey. So you want to allocate more of the signal range towards the darker tones. But HDR takes it up to another level. It really cranks it up. And so when you've got these monitors that can't really show the deepest levels of black, so what you end up with those monitors that can't really produce deep levels of blacks and that sort of thing is that a significant part of the HDR signal range is something that your monitor can't actually show. And so if content is sort of going, hey, I'd love to show some of those dark shadow detail type things with really low brightness levels, and your monitor can't actually show it, all that detail is just completely eliminated from the game. Like, it's just completely crushed. You can't see it. Whereas often what you see in those games is that the SDR implementation or the SDR image that you see is designed for that in mind. So you don't get as much of the shadow detail type of thing because not as much data is being allocated to those lower brightness ranges. And also games are just designed in a way where it doesn't really utilize those things. So the SDR mode on your LCD, you may actually see shadow detail better than you would see in the HDR mode, because the HDR mode is sort of going, oh, nice, I can now show all this shadow detail that I couldn't do previously. I'm going to go do that. And then if your monitor can't do it, you just can't see it. So yeah, one of the limitations that I often see on those sort of fake HDR products, you enable the HDR mode, it changes the image to look more contrasty, to give you more punch, but then it kind of just looks worse because it darkens the image into a range that the monitor is not designed for. And then obviously there's brightness limitations as well. You kind of get that on the other end where, content is sort of going, well, I'm designed for 1000 nits or maybe even 10,000 nits. I'm going to start utilizing different brightness signals for the high brightness range. I'm going to start punching things up, but then you may see clipping in the high brightness ranges on a monitor that can't actually utilize high brightness, in which case then the signal is going to look clipped and bad. And you can in some games, of course, reduce the brightness output using the sliders and those sorts of things, which can reduce the highlight clipping that you would see on those monitors that don't have high levels of brightness. But in other content, especially if the tone mapping on the monitor is very bad, you'll actually be losing a lot of detail in the image compared to what you would see from just running in the SDR mode. So yes, you may see some color benefits. I would say, generally speaking, don't do this because it will likely make the image look worse on your monitor. It may make the image look brighter, and so some people do enable the HDR mode and they go, oh, this looks better. This looks better than the SDR mode. That's often just because the monitor, instead of being run at whatever brightness you've set it in the SDR mode, is now running at a higher brightness level. And so you sort of, subjectively higher brightness images can look better, but you may be losing out in other areas. So if your monitor is an LCD and it doesn't have proper HDR hardware support, my advice is just use it as an SDR monitor. And that does it for part 2 of this Q&A series. That's all the questions that I wanted to get to in this sort of, I think we'll be publishing both of these parts in August, so I should probably call it the August Q&A. But anyway, that's all the questions I wanted to get to. So thanks to everyone that submitted them to us on the YouTube community tab and also our Discord chat. There's also part 1 where we go into a couple of other things you can go check out on Monitors Unboxed right now. And as always, if you want to support us, you can do so via Patreon. Links to that is in the description below. If you sign up, you get access to some cool benefits like our monthly live streams, Discord community, and other monitor benefits like our calibrated settings. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.